These are the stories that transcend sports. When you think of Mookie, you think about that big smile. So Glenn Burke was going to be their guy. Blass is like 18-6, and then in '73, the guy falls off the cliff. So they're all very, very different, but they all had one thing in common. They all had to deal with great adversity. I get asked all the time, well, wouldn't it be great to do a book with Mariano Rivera or with Derek Jeter? And, you know, of course I would do it. But, you know, Rivera and Jeter, from the time they were 15 years and older, I don't think they had a day of adversity for the rest of their lives. I mean, they just did their job so well. They were all-stars every year. They won World Series every single year. So those types of guys never really interested me that much in co-authoring their autobiographies. But these guys have amazing stories, overcoming and not overcoming, struggling and getting past those struggles, getting past drug use, getting past alcoholism, getting past, in Steve Blass's case, being this terrific pitcher and then the next day forgetting how to throw the ball straight. Those types of stories are what I'm really interested in doing. You have to realize the Los Angeles Dodgers in the early 70s to mid 70s, they were an incubator for one rookie of the year after another. I mean, Garvey, Say, Davey Lopes. They had all these great young players year after year after year. So Glenn Burke was going to be their guy. He was going to take over center field and be their center fielder for the next 20 years. He was nicknamed King Kong by his teammates. He played the game like Willie Mays. He was a five-tool player. He was going to be their guy. Well, a funny thing happened. They bring him up, and he plays for a year and a half with the Dodgers, and they find out he's gay. Back then, the Dodgers had a pristine image. They were drawing 3 million fans a year when the Yankees were drawing about 1.5 million. The Mets were drawing like less than 1 million. So the Dodgers had this brand, and they didn't want a gay baseball player. Now, everybody within the Dodgers organization knew that Glenn was gay. So they shipped Glenn Burke. This guy is just trouble. It's the late 70s. They ship him up to Oakland. They trade him to the A's for an aging Billy North. And Glenn thinks, okay, a new start. He was from the Bay Area. So he was somewhat excited about going home. And Billy Martin arrives. And Billy Martin didn't think too much about managing a gay player, no matter how good he was. Burke got sent down to the minor leagues, so he just decided to retire. These were the days before these first and second year players were making $1 million a year like they do today. So Burke was making about $60,000, and he was like, I don't need this. And he went on the Today Show, came out in an interview with Brian Gumbel, and no one really heard much about Glenn Burke for a long, long time until about 12 years later when he was dying of AIDS. And that is when, in the newspapers, there was one feature story after another about the only major leaguer to reveal his homosexuality as dying of AIDS. I'm wondering what it was like in the clubhouse, you know, how difficult that must have been. I mean, I still play baseball, so I know the mentality of the locker room and how hard that must have been in the 70s and early 80s. And so I contacted the Oakland A's, who were sending Glenn some money every month and taking care of him. He was on the streets. He was broke, homeless. And I said, I would really love to do a book with Glenn Burke. And they said, put together a book proposal. And so he had a stack of book proposals and some movie options, and he liked my book proposal. So I got a call to come out to California. He wasn't doing well. He was in his last months of his life. And he and we worked together on his life story. And the sad thing is, even though he read the manuscript, the final product, the book, he died about 3 weeks before the release of the book. We had a publisher, but then the baseball strike hit at the end of '94, and it was very common for book deals to get canceled out. Even though this book clearly transcended baseball, it was shelved. So Glenn was literally on his deathbed. And the interviews with him were 5 minutes, then we'd have to stop. 10 minutes, we'd have to stop. Because he'd be crying from the pain. And then he'd compose himself again. And so it was starting and stopping, starting and stopping. And so I thought that because Glenn went through all of that trouble for me to interview him, that I had to self-publish his book. Fast forward another almost 20 years, and all of a sudden, with the changes in society, with gay rights, gay marriage, gays in the military getting overturned, all this stuff is happening. Now it's a national phenomenon. Now Glenn Burke is back out in the newspapers again, back out in the magazine articles. So when I talk about dealing with adversity, Glenn Burke could be a poster child. When I think of Steve Blass, I think of something the great Bart Giamatti, who, had he lived, baseball would have been in better shape than it's in today. Bart Giamatti was the commissioner who ruled that Pete Rose would be ineligible from the game of baseball for the rest of his life for betting on the game. So anyway, Bart Giamatti said something. He wrote a poem, actually, when he was at Yale. He's a big Red Sox fan. He's from Connecticut, I believe. And it went like this. And every time I hear this, I think of Steve Blass. Baseball, it's designed to break your heart. It begins in the spring when everything begins again, and blossoms in the summer, filling our afternoons and evenings. But then when the chill of rain comes, it stops, leaving us to face the fall alone. When I think about that, I do think of Steve, because Steve Blass was every bit as big a part of the Pirates' World Championship in 1971 as Roberto Clemente. Clemente got the MVP, but it was Blass who stopped the Orioles' 15-game winning streak heading into Game 3. He was a World Series hero in 71 after compiling 6 or 7 really good seasons. Then in 72, Blass is like 18-6, makes the All-Star game, like a 2.2 something ERA, one of the best pitchers in baseball. And then in 73, the guy falls off the cliff in baseball terms. He can't find the strike zone. He's throwing balls behind hitters to the backstop. And then when he would get one over the plate, I mean, someone was hitting it 5 miles. So this guy went from being a 9-year veteran, great pitcher, to forgetting how to pitch completely, all in his mind. And the American lexicon phrase Steve Blass disease came obviously from Steve, for the guys like Rick Ankiel and Mark Wohlers, the guys that came later, who inadvertently forgot how to pitch. They just got bouts of wildness. Guys like Chuck Knobloch, Steve Sachs, it happened to those guys too. So Steve went from pitching in the World Series to just a few years later selling class rings to high school students just to feed his family. Really sad, especially if you know Steve. Steve is one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. All these guys are. But Steve, what a personality this guy has. This guy could be a comedian. He could do stand-up. He is naturally hilarious. And the thing about it is, on a whim, he auditioned to be the Pirates' color analyst on a fledgling cable station in 1983. And they had their regular station on the free channels back then, and then cable was in its infancy. Blass gets his shot, and he's hysterical. I mean, he's a knowledgeable baseball guy, but he talked about baseball also with these great stories, and he was politically incorrect. I mean, some of the stuff that he would say, which really appealed to the Pittsburgh audience a lot. And so he's still doing their games all these years later. And this guy might make the Hall of Fame as a broadcaster. You only need 10 years. He's had 31. And he's very good. And I think he should make the Hall of Fame just for staying with the Pirates all those years when they were awful. Now all of a sudden they're pretty good. Like, they made the wild card game a couple of years in a row, and no city deserves a champion more than those Pirates fans, than the Pittsburgh fans. So anyway, Blass, obviously, overcoming a lot. He overcame the adversity. He overcame a lot of demons, and he easily, his life, trust me, if you read the book, it could have ended numerous times over the years. His marriage is still intact, which is a miracle. There is stuff that I begged him to keep out. But you know, one of the great things about writing autobiographies with these guys is you learn their secrets. You know more about these guys than their wives, than their kids, because they tell you everything. It all comes out. It's very therapeutic. I'm talking to Bill Buckner now, who's a human. I mean, he's just a walking Greek tragedy, this guy. You know, he had over 2,700 hits, 2,715. 3,000 and you're a lock for the Hall of Fame, especially in his era, you know, pre-steroids. And Bill Buckner absolutely is a borderline Hall of Famer. And because of that one play, and this is a great segue into Mookie, because of that one play, that one error that he made in the World Series, that's all anybody thinks about. So these guys that deal with adversity, these are the best books to do, because there's the human element to it. You know, you watch these guys growing up, and you saw them struggle and overcome, and now you can't help but become great friends with these guys. We started off with Game 6 because Mookie said you gotta give the people what they want. So we actually start off with the play. You know, when he's up at the plate in Game 6, was it the 10th inning, 2 outs, and the Mets are trailing by a run at that point, and what's going through his head. And yes, before the inning started, none of the Mets really thought they had a chance. And with 2 outs and nobody on, they really didn't think that they had a chance. And they were going over in their heads how they were this team that won 108 games in the regular season, that found a way to beat the Houston Astros in what's arguably the greatest championship series of all time. I mean, they were dead. And Mike Scott was just Dr. Jekyll to these guys. I mean, they couldn't touch him. They were facing elimination, and they faced elimination a lot. And then with the Red Sox, people forget Game 7. They were losing 3-0. Very easy to forget. And they came back and they won that game. So, but in Game 6, they didn't think they had a shot. Then Carter keeps the inning alive with a single. And then it's Kevin Mitchell with a single. I mean, not well hit balls, just kind of like bleeders that find a way into the shallow outfield. And then Ray Knight, he singles. Another, you know, Schiraldi busted him in on his hands. Then they bring in Bob Stanley, and Stanley was not a good relief pitcher that year. And Bud Harrelson telling Kevin Mitchell at third, watch out, this guy's going to bounce one. And he did. He bounced it. Wild pitch, tying run scores. And then Mookie with the burp up the first baseline. And it goes through poor Bill Buckner's legs, who should not have been out there. The guy was on, he couldn't walk. I mean, he had high top spikes on, specially designed for him. The Red Sox even discussed in the dugout before the inning started, you know, should we send Stapleton out there like they did in every playoff game the Red Sox were leading in. They sent Dave Stapleton out there to fill in for Buckner because Buckner couldn't walk. And so many side stories that you find out about talking to Mookie. You know, how the Red Sox had Ray Knight picked off second while Mookie was up, and Stanley missed the pickoff sign, and Barrett and Buckner had to move over to their left a few steps, and then Mookie hits the ball to Buckner's left. And it was that extra step or two. He couldn't plant his feet on his 2 bad feet. Ball goes right through his legs. So there's all that, and today Buckner and Mookie, they're like business partners and great friends. They've made over $1 million signing that iconic photo. You know, it's just interesting. The same thing happened with Ralph Branca and Bobby Thompson. They went on the road too. You know, the 51 playoff where Thompson won the pennant for the Giants off of Branca. The thing about Mookie, though, First of all, yes, he is as nice as he appears. He is one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. And his background, he grew up in South Carolina during the mid to late 60s, early 70s. The bigotry in South Carolina at that time was off the charts. Mookie and a few of his brothers, they came back from a fishing trip. It was dusk. And, the good old boys in the pickup truck, and I mean, Mookie was like 9 or 10 years old, threatening their lives, that type of thing. But they all loved baseball, and as a family, they played baseball on the weekends together. And Mookie started playing ball in high school, and he's a great athlete. Originally, he was drafted by the Dodgers, but then the Mets came calling the next year when he was a junior. He was playing at the University of South Carolina at the time. They went to the College World Series, and he actually played against Yogi Brooks. So he comes up to the Mets. The Mets were horrible. He came up in 1980. Mets were, these were the post-Seaver days. They were perennial losers, and they'd have 4,000 or 5,000 fans at the games, and no doubt 3,000 of those fans were coming to see Johnny Bench or Mike Schmidt or somebody like that. They'd come to see the other team's stars because the Mets didn't have any. I mean, they had Lee Mazzilli. That was about it. So he watches as the team gets sold to the Doubledays. They bring in Frank Cashin to become the general manager. And all of a sudden, after all those losing seasons, like the byproduct of those losing seasons is you get high draft choices. So they start drafting Gooden, Strawberry, Kevin Mitchell, Lenny Dykstra. They start making some great trades. They get Ron Darling from Texas. They get Sid Fernandez from the Dodgers. So all of a sudden, then they make a trade for somebody named Keith Hernandez from the Cardinals, who the Cardinals, they were just coming off a World Series championship, but Keith Hernandez made some bad choices in life with the cocaine usage. So the Cardinals, St. Louis, it was like the Dodgers times 5 as far as wanting a pristine image. It was the Midwest. And so they dealt Keith Hernandez, a former MVP, for Neil Allen and Rick Ownby, I think it was. So the Mets, overnight, in '84, they go from being a last-place team to winning over 90 games, going right down to the last week of the season in '84 against the Cubs. And Mookie's right there. He has seen the transformation. Nobody else was there from '80, really through the whole decade, through until '89, when he gets traded to Toronto. So he sees the transformation of this horrible team, cellar dwellers, every year, to becoming a team in '86 that wins 108 games, and they do it running away. I mean, they had it wrapped up at the All-Star break. They were up 13 games. And they didn't just win, but you know what the game's missing today? They're missing characters like the Mets had. You had characters like Lenny Dykstra, who I interviewed a couple of weeks ago for this new project that I'm doing. He is as wacky. It was the most bizarre interview I've ever had. And then you have guys like Kevin Mitchell, who grew up in a gang in San Diego. He still has the shrapnel in his back from getting shot. You had guys like Ray Knight, who was a Golden Gloves boxer, who was involved in every brawl that they got in that year. This was a heavy drinking, heavy partying team. But when it was game time, they only knew one way to play, and that was to play to win. And whatever it took, they didn't care. There has never been a team that good with the number of characters that the '86 Mets had. So Mookie was kind of the port in the storm. The kind of guy where guys, were doing shot after shot on the plane rides home. Mookie was sitting there reading his Bible with Gary Carter. He was kind of above the fray. And it's an interesting perspective because Mookie doesn't judge any of those guys like he could, like you might think somebody like that might. I mean, Mookie is about to be an ordained minister, and he loved that team. And he said, if I ever started a team, I'd want 25 guys just like that, because that's the way it is in baseball. The other thing that I guess got a lot of headlines with Mookie's book was the fact that he referred to himself as a hood ornament. So Mookie has been in the Mets organization for pretty much 30 years, except for those 3 years with Toronto. And that got a lot of publicity, because when you think of Mookie, you think about that big smile, that 1,000-watt smile, that Magic Johnson kind of smile that Mookie has all the time. But he wasn't a happy camper for a lot of those years with the Mets, because he was playing every day. So he wanted to play every day and felt that he could. And Lenny comes along, and he played the high road with him. He nurtured Lenny, as a rookie, showed him the ropes. But he wanted to play every day. And after '86, Mookie wanted to get traded. He said, you're probably better off with Lenny. He takes more pitches. He's the more prototypical leadoff hitter. And so the Mets wouldn't trade either one of them. They liked the platoon. They liked the Dykstra-Wilson platoon, just like they liked the Tuffle-Backman platoon at second base, just like they liked the Knight Howard-Johnson platoon at third. They felt like it made these guys work harder. But it just reached a point where in '89, the Mets from within were just imploding. I think it was Bobby Ojeda that called it a shooting star. They were just too volatile. They were like dynamite, that team, with the personalities, and it couldn't last. And you had Doc Gooden, with the cocaine issue in the spring of '87. Then later on, Strawberry, and then you have guys that it wasn't public, but they had their own demons that they were dealing with. And so they started to blow up the club in '89. So that's the second part of the book. Yeah, you have, Mookie growing up in South Carolina, dirt poor. His father made $25 a week as a sharecropper to feed his family of 14. And then you have his Mets days, and then the latter part of his life, getting back into baseball and the Mets organization, and the disappointments in not getting a high-level job where, he could utilize his knowledge of baseball and his knowledge of winning in New York City, which is very hard. Like these young players, they come up and they don't know what to expect. I mean, you can get in a lot of trouble. I mean, you're a young 23, 24-year-old in New York, with all the temptations and the women throwing themselves at you and the money now. So Mookie's point in the latter part of the book is, why won't the Mets utilize the resources that they have? I mean, they have nothing to worry about with these guys, and they have all this knowledge, and they could bring them back, and they choose not to. I guess the guy right now, well, you have Wally Backman, he's managing AAA, and you have Tim Tuffle, who's coaching third, at least for now. But forget about a manager. It's not going to happen from that crew. They're distancing themselves from that team, and they might deny it, but it's true. It's Game 6, and a woman goes into labor. The woman who's bringing Mookie her book. She just started to go into labor. She says to her husband, who's watching Game 6, sweetheart, we've got to go. My water just broke. And he goes, I mean, this is it. The Mets are down 2. It's the 10th inning. Just a few minutes, it's probably over. So Mookie's up at the plate, and, they're down 1, and then there's the wild pitch, and it's a tie game. So this thing could go into extra innings. There's 2 out. I mean, unless Mookie gets a hit, she's thinking, she's not sure if the husband's going to leave or not. He's a big fan. So Mookie hits the ball, and it goes through Buckner's legs. The Mets win. They win game 6. The couple gets in the car to go to the hospital. 27 years later, she shows up in Brooklyn and thanks Mookie for enabling her to get to the hospital in time. the one that I think meant the most to Mookie, he signed about 2,300 books in 6 days. And this man's online, and he comes up, and I guess he's about, I would guess 55, 60 years old, something like that. And he comes up, and he goes, I want you to know, I've already read the book. You know, it's an easy read, great read, really loved it. But I want you to know something, Mookie. I read the part about you going back to college and finishing up after your playing days were over. Mookie graduated from Mercy College. I guess he was about 50 years old. And this guy said, you have convinced me to go back and finish, you know, to finish and get my degree. And that, I think, meant more to Mookie than anything, because when we wrote this book, he wanted it to change lives. You know, he wanted, through his own experiences, to reach out to people so they can identify with him, and that really hit home with him. My goal is that when you read these books about, you know, about these guys, it's like you're sitting in their backyard having a beer with them. We spend 9 hours in his living room dissecting Game 7 of the 71 series, pitch by pitch. Gedman and Stanley, to this day, still disagree on whether it was a wild pitch or a pass ball. It's because there are so many predators out there that try and take advantage of these guys. I believe he's exactly what the Mets need. He's probably what the fans need. So to blame Buckner for the Red Sox loss is really, you haven't watched the game.